The wind had teeth, and it gnawed at the exposed skin of Alara's face, turning her cheeks a raw, mottled red. It was a late November wind, carrying the first sharp promise of the ice that would soon entomb Providence Gulch for 5 unforgiving months. It swept down from the jagged peaks of the Sorrowful Mountains, a relentless harbinger of the coming hardship, and funneled through the town's single, muddy street with a mournful howl. For most, this wind was a signal to bank the fires high, to check the seals on their window frames, and to settle into the familiar rhythm of winter's siege. For Alara, it was the sound of her own ruin. She stood before the mercantile, a thin wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, a useless gesture against a cold that had already settled deep in her bones. The cold of hunger, of fear, of a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, making each breath a shallow, painful effort. Inside the store, the warm, yellow lantern light illuminated jars of preserves, sacks of flour, and the cheerful faces of her neighbors. She could see Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, laughing as she measured out a length of calico, her voice a low hum Alara could no longer hear. They were inside, and she was out. The distinction had never been so stark, so absolute. It had been a month since Thomas had been buried, his lungs finally surrendering to the fever that had consumed him over a long, agonizing week. It had been an hour since Mr. Croft, the town's banker and sole proprietor of its Mercy, had locked the door to the small clapboard house she and Thomas had rented, the house that held the meager sum of their shared life. The debt was Thomas's, he had explained with a reptilian smile, but the consequences were now hers. Eviction was a clean, simple word for an act so brutal. He had allowed her a single carpet bag. Inside it were her husband's spare shirt, a tarnished silver locket from her mother, and a half-eaten loaf of bread that was already growing stale. The town watched her fall. They watched with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Thomas had been a dreamer, a man whose ambitions always outpaced his abilities, leaving a trail of small debts and broken promises. Alara, by extension, was now seen as part of that failure. The women who had once shared a cup of tea with her now averted their eyes, clutching their purses a little tighter as she passed. She was a widow, a pauper, a burden waiting to happen. She was a mirror reflecting a fate they all feared, and they could not bear to look. 2 of those women, bundled in thick coats, now exited the mercantile, their arms laden with parcels. They paused under the wooden awning, their conversation snagging in the wind. "It's a shame, is what it is," one said, her voice sharp with judgment. "A young woman, left with nothing. She ought to find a way to be useful," the other, a woman named Beatrice whom Alara had once considered a friend, nodded grimly. "What way is there? No family to take her in. The only man with land enough to support another mouth is Silas Blackwood, and God knows he's not looking for a wife." A dry, mirthless laugh followed. "He's turned down every respectable daughter in this valley, including my Mary. Prefers his own company up on that ridge. They say he's half wild himself. Cold as the stone he built his house from." Alara shrank back into the shadows of the alley beside the mercantile, the word striking her like thrown rocks. Silas Blackwood. The name was a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to frighten children and disappoint matchmaking mothers. A man who lived alone on a homestead carved out of the mountain's flank, a place the townsfolk called Blackwood's Reach. He came to town only twice a year for supplies, a silent, imposing figure with eyes the color of a winter storm. He spoke to no one, and no one dared to speak to him. He was a creature of the wilderness, an outcast by choice. The women's footsteps faded, leaving Alara alone with the howling wind and a desperate, terrifying idea. It was an ember of a thought, born not of hope but of the absolute absence of it. The town had cast her out. The coming winter would surely kill her. What was left to lose? Her pride had been stripped away along with her home. Her dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford. The wind bit her again, a savage, impatient snap. She looked up towards the mountains, their peaks already white with the first snows, a stark and brutal kingdom rising against the bruised twilight sky. Somewhere up there was a man who preferred loneliness to the company of others. Perhaps, she thought, her breath misting in the frigid air, he simply hadn't been offered the right bargain. She clutched the thin handle of her carpet bag, the rough fabric abrading her frozen knuckles. The choice was simple and stark. To die slowly in the cold charity of the town's disdain, or to walk toward the one man as outcast as she was and gamble the last shred of her life on a single, audacious question. She took a step, then another, her back to the warm, judgmental lights of Providence Gulch, her face turned toward the unforgiving wilderness and the cold stone house of Silas Blackwood. The path to Blackwood's Reach was less a path and more a suggestion. It was a faint deer trail that snaked upward from the valley floor, a treacherous ribbon of mud and loose scree that clung to the mountainside. The wind was a constant, physical bully, shoving at her back, tearing at her shawl, and whispering icy threats in her ear. Each step was a battle. Her worn leather shoes, never meant for such a climb, offered little purchase, and twice she slipped, her hands scraping raw against the frozen earth. The sun, a pale, indifferent disk, began its descent, painting the undersides of the clouds in morbid shades of purple and gray. The air grew colder, sharper, slicing into her lungs. The town below shrank to a scattering of insignificant lights, a world she no longer belonged to. She was trespassing now, moving from the known world of men into the untamed territory of a legend. The stories about Silas Blackwood circled in her mind like vultures. They said he'd killed a man in a card game down in the territories. They said his family had been run out of a more civilized place for unspeakable reasons. They said he communed with spirits in the high peaks. The truth, Elara suspected, was likely far more mundane and therefore more tragic, but the fictions served their purpose. They kept people away. They kept him isolated. As she climbed, the landscape became more severe. The gentle pines of the lower valley gave way to stunted, wind-twisted firs and great, moss-covered boulders that looked like sleeping giants. The world was stripped down to its essential elements, rock, wood, and a sky that promised only snow. She was exhausted, a deep, soul-crushing weariness that went beyond the physical. Every muscle screamed in protest. But the fear was a more potent fuel than strength. The image of freezing to death in an alley, her body discovered stiff and blue in the morning, was a far more terrifying prospect than facing a silent recluse. It was this terror that drove her onward, one agonizing step at a time. Finally, as the last of the light bled from the sky, she saw it. A plume of wood smoke, thick and gray, rising against the dark backdrop of the pines. It was a sign of life, of warmth, a beacon in the encroaching desolation. A few more minutes of scrambling over a rocky outcrop, and she was there. The homestead was nestled in a small, protected basin, a fortress against the elements. A single, sturdy cabin built of dark, massive logs stood beside a well-constructed barn. The clearing was meticulously tidy, with neatly stacked cords of firewood that stood taller than a man, a testament to seasons of relentless preparation. It was not the den of a savage, but the work of a deliberate, disciplined man. And there he was. Silas Blackwood was in the center of the clearing, his back to her. He was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound besides the wind. He was taller than she remembered from his rare visits to town, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his worn flannel shirt. He moved with an economy of motion, a powerful grace that spoke of a life of hard, physical labor. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. Just the swing, the crack of splitting wood, the fall of the two perfect halves. He was a part of the landscape, as solid and unyielding as the mountain itself. Elara's courage, which had carried her all this way, faltered. She stood at the edge of the clearing, hidden by the deepening shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was real. The legend was flesh and blood, and she was about to intrude upon his solitude with a proposal that bordered on madness. What had she been thinking? He would laugh at her. He would curse her and send her back down the mountain to freeze. He was a man who had purposefully built a life devoid of other people. Why would he welcome a destitute widow into it? She should turn back. She could try to find shelter in an abandoned prospector's shack, or beg for a place in someone's barn. But she knew those were lies she told herself. There was no other shelter. There was no charity left for her in Providence Gulch. This was the end of the line. He stopped, planting the axe head deep into the splitting block. He stood for a moment, motionless, as if sensing her presence. Then, slowly, he turned. His face was stark in the twilight, all sharp angles and shadows. His beard was dark and untrimmed, and his eyes, even from this distance, seemed to hold the same cold, gray light as the winter sky. He wasn't surprised to see her. There was no shock in his expression, only a quiet, unnerving watchfulness. He waited. The silence stretched, pulled taut between them. It was her move. Elara took a deep breath, the frigid air stinging her throat, and stepped out from the trees. She walked across the clearing, each step feeling heavy and loud on the hard-packed earth. She clutched her carpet bag like a shield. She stopped about 10 feet from him, not wanting to crowd the wildness she sensed in him. Her voice, when it finally came, was a hoarse, desperate croak. "Mr. Blackwood," he said nothing. He simply watched her, his gaze unwavering, taking in her threadbare shawl, her chapped face, the desperation that must have been radiating from her like a fever. She had to say it. She had to say it now, before the last of her nerve deserted her. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. The words tumbled out, stark and unadorned, stripped of all propriety. "They say you've turned down every woman in town." A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, or weary resignation, passed through his eyes, but he remained silent. She pressed on, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I'm not looking for a courtship, and I'm not asking for charity. I can work. I can cook, clean, mend. I can keep a house. I have nothing. No home, no money. The winter is here." She paused, letting the weight of her predicament settle in the air between them. This was it. The final, desperate gamble. "So I'm asking you, Mr. Blackwood. You want a wife to see you through it, or do you just want another lonely winter?" The echo of her own audacious words hung in the frigid air, thin and brittle. Silas Blackwood did not move. He did not laugh, nor did he scowl. The great, impassive stillness he possessed seemed to deepen, drawing the very light and sound from the clearing into himself. He stood with the axe at his side, his knuckles white where he gripped the handle, and simply looked at her. It was the most unnerving gaze Elara had ever endured. It was not the leering look of a lonely man, nor the dismissive glance of a superior one. It was analytical, appraising. He was looking at her the way a man might assess a horse for soundness or a tool for its utility. He took in her worn-out shoes, caked with mud from the climb, the tremor in her hands that she could not conceal, the defiant tilt of her chin that was the only thing holding her together. He was weighing her, measuring her desperation against her potential for endurance. Elara's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The silence stretched into a minute, then two. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face, and she resisted the urge to brush it away, to show any sign of fidgeting or weakness. She had made her offer. All she could do now was stand and wait for the verdict. She expected a dismissal. A curt, "Get off my land," a jerk of his head toward the dark path she had just climbed. She had prepared herself for the humiliation, for the long, cold walk back down to her inevitable demise. What she had not prepared for was the slow, deliberate way he finally moved. He pulled the axe from the block, the sharp shink of steel leaving wood echoing in the twilight. He turned and walked toward the cabin, his heavy boots crunching on the frozen ground. He hadn't said a word. For a terrible moment, she thought he was simply ignoring her, leaving her to stand there until she froze. But he stopped at the door, his hand on the rough-hewn latch, and looked back at her over his shoulder. "You can pull your weight." His voice was a low rumble, rough and unused, like stones grinding together. It wasn't a question so much as a demand for confirmation. "Yes," she said, the word coming out stronger than she felt. I can, he gave a single, curt nod. The work is hard. The winter is long. There are rules, he laid them out as if listing inventory. You tend the house. The cooking, the cleaning, the mending. You'll care for the chickens and the milk goat. You don't question my business. You don't pry into my past. We are partners in survival. Nothing more. Each sentence was a stone laid in the foundation of their arrangement, cold, hard, and practical. There was no room for sentiment, no hint of kindness. It was a contract for mutual benefit. He would get a warm house and hot meals. She would get to live. Is that understood? He asked, his gray eyes boring into her. Yes, she whispered, a wave of dizzying relief washing over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. It's understood. Then get inside before you freeze solid, he said, and with that, he turned and pushed the door open, disappearing into the darkness of the cabin. The invitation was as devoid of warmth as the landscape around them, but it was an invitation nonetheless. Elara hesitated for only a second before scurrying after him, dragging her meager carpet bag behind her. The interior of the cabin was dark and smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else, the faint, musky scent of a place long inhabited by a solitary man. It was a single large room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace where a bed of coals glowed a deep, menacing red. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made with a pile of dark wool blankets, was pushed against the far wall. In another corner, shelves were stacked with tins and supplies. It was sparse, meticulously clean, and utterly masculine. Silas moved to the fireplace, adding several logs from a nearby woodbox. He worked the bellows until the coals ignited, and flames began to lick at the fresh wood, casting flickering, dancing shadows across the room. He did not look at her or speak to her. He moved with a silent, self-contained purpose, as if she were not there at all. The sudden warmth from the fire was a shock to her frozen skin, a painful tingling that spread through her fingers and toes. She stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of where to put herself, what to do. She was an intruder, a foreign object in this well-ordered, solitary world. There's a cot and bedding in that chest, he said without turning around, gesturing with his chin toward a large wooden trunk near the hearth. That's yours. Put your things there. She did as she was told, her movements stiff and clumsy. She opened the chest and found a simple canvas cot, folded neatly, along with 2 thick blankets and a small, flat pillow. She set it up on the opposite side of the room from his bed, creating as much distance as the small cabin would allow. The physical space between them felt like a vast, unbridgeable chasm. He went to a cast-iron stove in the corner and began preparing a meal. He moved with the same efficiency he'd shown with the axe, slicing salted pork, adding it to a pan of beans. The smell of frying meat filled the small space, a rich, savory aroma that made Elara's empty stomach clench with a painful, desperate hunger. She hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. He ate standing by the stove, scooping the beans and pork directly from the skillet onto a tin plate. He did not offer her any. He did not invite her to the table. He simply ate his fill, then scraped the rest of the food onto a second plate and set it on the table. He gestured toward it with his fork. Eat, he commanded, then turned his back on her to clean his skillet. Elara approached the table as if it were a wild animal. She sat down, her hands trembling as she picked up the fork. The food was hot, salty, and the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate quickly, ravenously, not daring to look at him, feeling his silent presence behind her like a physical weight. When she was finished, she took her plate to the wash basin, cleaned it, and set it to dry, mimicking the actions she had seen him perform. This was the start of their life together. An exchange of labor for shelter. A partnership of silence and necessity. As she unfolded her blankets onto the cot, the reality of her situation settled in. She was alive. She had a roof over her head and a fire to keep her from freezing. But she had traded one kind of isolation for another, an outcast in a town of many for a stranger in a house of one. The man across the room was a mystery, a locked door. And the winter, she knew, had only just begun. The first days in Silas Blackwood's cabin were a lesson in silence and labor. Elara learned that the rhythm of his life was governed not by conversation, but by the relentless demands of the coming winter. There was always a task that needed doing, a preparation to be made, a bulwark to be reinforced against the season's siege. Her life, which in town had been measured by social calls and the chiming of the church bell, was now dictated by the rising and setting of a weak, winter sun and the ever-present list of chores. Silas was not a cruel master, but he was an exacting one. He taught her not with words, but with terse gestures and pointed looks. When she failed to bank the fire properly on the first night, causing it to die out and fill the cabin with a bone-deep chill by morning, he said nothing. He simply rebuilt it himself, and as he laid the logs, he glanced at her, then at the flue, a clear, unspoken instruction. She did not make the mistake again. She learned to haul water from the well, the wooden buckets so heavy they bruised her shoulders and made her arms ache with a fire she had never known. She learned to milk the temperamental goat, whose sharp horns and stubborn nature seemed a reflection of its owner. She collected eggs from the small flock of chickens in the barn, her frozen fingers fumbling with the small, precious spheres of warmth. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to needlepoint, quickly became red, chapped, and calloused. Every muscle in her body protested. In the evenings, she would collapse onto her cot, every fiber of her being humming with an exhaustion so profound it left no room for the anxieties that had plagued her in town. This, she realized, might have been part of his intention. A body too tired to worry was a body that could endure. Inside the cabin, she swept the rough planked floors, mended the tears in his coarse work clothes with tiny, neat stitches, and learned the geography of his larder. She discovered he was a man of immense foresight. The shelves were packed with jars of preserved vegetables, smoked meats, sacks of flour, beans, and rice. He was prepared not for one winter, but for 3. It was the hoard of a man who trusted no one and nothing but his own 2 hands. The silence between them was a living entity. It filled the spaces her chatter might have once occupied. At first, it was a suffocating blanket of awkwardness. She found herself biting back questions, comments about the weather, the small, meaningless pleasantries that greased the wheels of society. But such things had no place here. They were a currency he did not trade in. He seemed to prefer the quiet, to move within it as if it were his natural element. She began to study him in those quiet moments, when he sat at the table in the evening, sharpening a knife or oiling a piece of leather. His face in the firelight was a map of a hard life. Deep lines were etched around his eyes and mouth. A pale, thin scar cut through his left eyebrow, a relic of some past violence he would never speak of. His hands were large and scarred, but his movements were surprisingly deft as he worked. He never seemed to be at rest, even in stillness, there was a coiled energy about him, a constant, vigilant watchfulness. He was a man who seemed to be perpetually listening for a threat just beyond the walls. He ate what she cooked without comment. Whether the stew was savory or the bread slightly burnt, his reaction was the same, a quiet consumption of the fuel he needed for the next day's work. She learned not to expect praise or criticism. Her reward was the empty plate he left behind. One afternoon, a week into her stay, she found a small crate of potatoes in the root cellar that had begun to sprout. She spent the afternoon carefully cutting out the eyes and rubbing them with ash, preparing them for a spring planting she wasn't even sure she would be there to see. It was an act of faith, of assuming a future. When Silas came in from the barn, he saw the small pile of prepared seed potatoes on the table. He stopped and looked at them, then at her. She braced herself for a reprimand, for intruding on his plans, for touching what was his. He said nothing. He simply picked one up, turned it over in his calloused palm, and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He then set it down and went about his evening chores. That small gesture felt like a monumental victory. It was an acknowledgement. An acceptance of her contribution beyond the bare minimum of their contract. She had not just performed a task, she had shown initiative, a knowledge of husbandry that went beyond cooking and cleaning. She had, in a small way, invested in the future of this place. That night, the wind howled with a new ferocity, driving pellets of sleet against the single windowpane like a frantic, desperate tapping. The sound was lonely and violent. Elara sat on her cot, patching one of Thomas's old shirts, a garment she kept for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. It was a link to a life that already felt distant, a life of softness and failure. She looked across the room at Silas, who was staring into the fire, his expression unreadable. She wondered what he saw in the flames. Did he see faces from his past? Did he feel the weight of winter spent in this same, profound solitude? For the first time, she did not see him as a savior or a captor. She saw him as a man encased in a fortress of his own making, and she, for now, was the sole inhabitant of his lonely kingdom. The cold outside was immense, but for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt the barest flicker of something that was not fear. It was not warmth, not yet. It was simply the feeling of being anchored, of having a purpose, however grim and demanding. She was a partner in survival. And survival, she was learning, was a full-time occupation. The first true snow did not fall gently. It arrived with the fury of an invading army, a blizzard that descended from the peaks without warning and threw a thick, white blanket over the world. The wind shrieked, a mad chorus of lost souls, and the air grew so thick with swirling flakes that the barn, only 50 yards from the cabin, vanished entirely. For 3 days, they were prisoners in the small log house, the world beyond their walls erased. The isolation was absolute. The howling of the wind was a constant assault on the senses, a relentless reminder of their vulnerability. It was during this forced confinement that the carefully constructed space between them began to shrink. There was no escaping each other's presence. The single room felt smaller, the air thicker with their shared existence. On the second day of the storm, a powerful gust of wind tore a wooden shutter from its leather hinges. It slammed against the side of the cabin with a deafening crack, and a shower of snow and ice blasted through the now exposed windowpane. A wave of Arctic air flooded the room, instantly stealing the warmth from the fire. Silas moved without a moment's hesitation. "The rope," he yelled over the roar of the wind, his first loud utterance since she had arrived. "In the barn." Elara's mind went blank with panic. The barn was an impossible distance away, a journey into a white, roaring void. "I can't," she started to say, but he was already pulling on his heavy coat and wrapping a scarf around his face. "Stay here. Keep the fire high," he commanded, and then he was gone, plunging into the storm. He had tied one end of a long rope to the cabin's door latch before he left. Elara watched, her heart in her throat, as the rope played out, a thin, fragile lifeline disappearing into the swirling chaos. She did as she was told, piling logs onto the fire, her hands shaking. The cold in the room was savage. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The rope went slack. He was at the barn. She imagined him fighting his way through the wind, the snow blinding him. She imagined him falling, the rope being buried, her being left here alone. The fear was a cold, sharp thing in her gut. Then, she felt a tug on the rope. 1, 2, 3 firm pulls. It was a signal. He was coming back. She ran to the door, her own fear forgotten, and pulled, adding her slight weight to his struggle, guiding him back toward the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. He stumbled through the doorway a moment later, covered in snow, a coil of thick rope in one hand and a hammer in the other. He was breathing hard, his beard caked with ice. He didn't pause to catch his breath. He went straight to the window, and with Elara holding a lantern aloft to light his work, he began to board it up from the inside, using spare planks from under his bed. They worked together in a frantic, silent ballet. She handed him nails before he had to ask for them. He moved with a swift, brutal efficiency, his hammer blows echoing the violent rhythm of the storm. In those few intense minutes, they were not a master and a servant, or a recluse and a refugee. They were two people fighting a common enemy, their survival dependent on their shared effort. When the last board was nailed in place, sealing them into a dim, firelit cocoon, the roar of the wind was muffled to a low, frustrated moan. The immediate crisis was over. Silas sagged against the wall for a moment, the immense physical effort leaving him winded. Elara, without thinking, went to the stove and poured the last of the morning's coffee into a mug, reheating it until it was steaming. She brought it to him. "Here," she said softly. He looked from the mug to her face, a flicker of surprise in his tired eyes. He took it, his calloused, half-frozen fingers brushing against hers. The brief contact was like a spark, a jolt of unexpected warmth. He drank the coffee in long, grateful swallows. "Thank you," he rasped, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. It was the first time he had thanked her for anything. The storm raged for another day, but something inside the cabin had shifted. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the memory of their shared struggle, with the faint warmth of his gratitude. Later that evening, while tidying the shelves, Elara's hand brushed against a small, cloth-wrapped bundle tucked away at the very back. Curious, she unwrapped it. Inside was a small, crudely carved wooden doll. Its calico dress was faded, and one of its button eyes was missing, but it had clearly been cherished, its wooden face worn smooth by small hands. It was a profoundly personal object, a relic of a life before this harsh solitude. She felt a pang of guilt for her intrusion but couldn't bring herself to put it back without knowing. She took it to the fire where Silas was cleaning his rifle. She held it out to him. "I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at the doll, and for a fleeting instant, the hard mask of his face softened. A deep, ancient sadness flickered in his eyes. He took the doll from her, his large, rough fingers surprisingly gentle as they cradled the small toy. "It was my sister's," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Lily. She died of the fever when she was 7. A long time ago." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The 3 short sentences were a crack in the fortress wall, a glimpse into the heart of his sorrow. He had not always been alone. He had loved, and he had lost. It was the first piece of his history he had ever offered, a small, precious gift of vulnerability. Elara nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She was lucky to have a brother who kept her memory safe. He looked at her then, a long, searching look. It was a look of recognition, of shared grief. He had lost a sister. She had lost a husband. They were both survivors of loss, marooned in the present by the wreckage of their pasts. He carefully rewrapped the doll in its cloth and placed it back on the shelf, not in the back, but closer to the front, where it could be seen. The storm finally broke on the 4th morning, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a pristine, silent blanket of white. The sun rose on a landscape of breathtaking, brutal beauty. The immediate danger had passed, but inside the cabin, the thaw had just begun. The blizzard marked a turning point, a subtle shift in the cabin's emotional climate. The deep snows of December arrived, locking them into their high-altitude world and cutting them off completely from Providence Gulch. Weeks bled into one another, measured by the rhythms of chopping wood, hauling water, and the slow, steady consumption of their winter stores. The hard labor, which had once been a source of agonizing pain for Elara, now felt natural. A new, wiry strength had settled into her limbs. Her hands were permanently calloused, a testament to her survival, and she wore them like a badge of honor. She no longer felt like a guest living on borrowed time, but a functioning part of the homestead. Her presence had softened the cabin's hard, masculine edges. She had scrubbed the floorboards until they shone faintly in the firelight. She mended the curtains with careful, even stitches. She found a patch of sunlight by the window and nurtured a small pot of herbs, their green, hopeful scent a welcome contrast to the smells of smoke and drying wool. She learned his habits, his preferences, the unspoken language of his moods. She knew by the set of his jaw whether the traps he'd checked that day were empty. She knew by the way he stoked the fire that a new storm was rolling in. She learned to move around him in the small space, a quiet choreography of shared existence. He, in turn, began to accommodate her presence in small, almost imperceptible ways. He built a small shelf for her few belongings next to her cot. He started leaving a bucket of fresh water just inside the door each morning so she wouldn't have to make the first icy trip to the well. One evening, he returned from his trapline not with a rabbit or a grouse, but with a handful of frost-touched rose hips. He dropped them on the table without a word. Elara knew they were rich in physic and would help ward off winter sickness. She spent the evening boiling them into a tart, fragrant tea. As she handed him a steaming mug, their eyes met over the rim. In his gaze, she saw not just acknowledgement, but a flicker of something that resembled care. Trust was being built, not with words, but with these small, consistent acts of mutual provision. It was a structure as solid and deliberately constructed as the cabin itself. One night, as a bitter wind rattled the boarded-up window, Elara found herself humming an old lullaby her mother used to sing. She stopped abruptly, embarrassed, expecting a sharp look or a gruff command for silence. But Silas said nothing. He sat by the fire, mending a snowshoe, and the only change in his demeanor was a slight slowing of his hands, as if he were listening. Tentatively, she began to hum again, softly. He continued his work, the quiet, melancholic tune filling the space between them. It was a fragile offering, a piece of her own past laid bare, and he had accepted it without question. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for so long began to recede. It was still there, a shadow in the corners of the room, but it no longer had the same suffocating power. She was not alone. She was with a man who understood the value of silence, who spoke through action, and whose quiet presence had become a strange and unexpected comfort. The greatest threat, she had once believed, was the winter. But she was coming to realize that the cruelty of nature was honest and predictable. It was the cruelty of men that was far more dangerous. And she feared it was only a matter of time before the world they had left behind in Providence Gulch found a way to claw its way back up the mountain. Her fears were realized on a surprisingly mild afternoon in late January. A thaw had briefly set in, making the trail from town passable for a determined rider. Elara was outside, scattering feed for the chickens, when she heard the sound of a horse struggling up the final ascent. Her stomach tightened into a cold knot. It wasn't Silas's horse. Silas had emerged from the barn, a woodsman's axe held loosely in his hand, his body already tense and watchful. A moment later, a rider appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was Mr. Croft, the banker. He sat atop a fine-looking bay horse, his expensive wool coat and derby hat looking absurdly out of place in the rugged wilderness. He surveyed the homestead with a proprietary air, his lips curled into a familiar, smug sneer. His eyes landed on Elara, and his sneer widened. "Well, well," he called out, his voice oily and loud in the quiet air. "The lost little bird has found a new nest. And with the beast of Blackwood's reach, no less. I must say, Mrs. Miller, you are more resourceful than I gave you credit for." Elara felt a hot flush of shame and anger. She stood her ground, her chin held high, the feed bucket clutched in her hand. "What do you want, Mr. Croft?" Silas took a slow, deliberate step forward, moving to stand slightly in front of her. He didn't speak, but his presence was a clear and menacing shield. Croft's gaze flickered to Silas, a brief flash of apprehension in his eyes before his arrogance reasserted itself. "I'm here on business, Blackwood. This woman's late husband, Thomas Miller, died owing me a considerable sum. As his widow, that debt now falls to her. I've come to collect." "She has nothing," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "She works for her keep." "Oh, I'm sure she does," Croft said, his words dripping with insinuation. He dismounted, walking closer, his polished boots sinking into the mud and snow. "But the law is the law. A debt must be paid. And since she has no money, I am prepared to be creative. I hold the note on this land, Blackwood. Your father's note. One late payment, and it's forfeit. Perhaps Mrs. Miller could work off her debt to me. In town. Under my supervision, the threat was vile and unmistakable. He wasn't just after money. He was here to assert his power, to humiliate Elara, to break the small sanctuary she had found. He wanted to drag her back down to the town that had cast her out and make her an object of his cruel patronage. This was the test. All the strength she had gathered over the past months, all the resilience she had forged in the face of hardship, it all came to a head in this one, ugly moment. Elara's blood ran cold at Croft's vile suggestion, but a fire of pure rage ignited in her chest, burning away the last vestiges of fear. She was no longer the broken, weeping woman he had thrown out into the street. She had survived the mountain. She had survived the storm. She would survive him. She took a step forward, moving out from behind Silas's protective shadow. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was as cold and hard as the winter ground beneath her feet. Thomas's debts died with him, Mr. Croft. I owe you nothing. This is my home now. You are not welcome here. Croft let out a short, ugly laugh. Your home. This hovel. Don't be a fool, woman. You are nothing but a squatter, a kept woman for a man who's too strange to find a proper wife. The law is on my side. I have the papers. He took another step toward her, his face contorted with malice. You will come back with me. You will work off what you owe, one way or another. She said no. Silas's voice cut through the air, flat and final. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. Croft turned his attention to Silas, his confidence wavering slightly in the face of the larger man's implacable calm. Stay out of this, Blackwood. This is a matter of business, of legality. It doesn't concern you. You're on my land, Silas said, taking another slow, deliberate step forward. The axe in his hand was no longer held loosely, his grip had tightened, the knuckles showing white. Threatening my wife. It concerns me. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and irrefutable. My wife. He had not said it as part of their contract, not as a convenience or a legal fiction. He had said it like a shield. Like a claim. Like a promise. The sound of it sent a jolt through Elara, a profound and startling warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the cabin. It was the sound of belonging. Croft scoffed, trying to regain his footing. Wife. You expect anyone to believe that? There's no record, no preacher. I don't care what you believe, Silas interrupted, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. I care that you are on my property, and you are not leaving fast enough. He took one more step. He was now close enough that his shadow fell over the banker. Croft, for all his bluster, was a man of paper and intimidation, not of physical violence. He looked at the cold fury in Silas's eyes, at the powerful set of his shoulders, at the heavy axe held in his hand, and his courage finally shattered. This isn't over, Croft stammered, backing away toward his horse. I'll be back. I'll bring the sheriff. I'll see you both thrown off this mountain. He clumsily mounted his horse, yanking on the reins with unnecessary force. You'll regret this, Blackwood. With a final, hateful glare, he spurred the horse and galloped away, his retreat as undignified as his arrival had been arrogant. He disappeared over the rise, the sound of his horse's panicked retreat fading into the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains. The clearing was quiet again. The immediate threat was gone, but the air was thick with the residue of the confrontation, charged with unspoken emotions. Elara stood frozen, her heart still pounding from the adrenaline. She had faced him. She hadn't backed down. She looked at Silas. He was still standing in the same spot, his body coiled like a wolf's, his gaze fixed on the path Croft had taken. He was a bastion, a wall of silent, protective strength. He had defended her. He had called her his wife. Slowly, he uncoiled. The tension left his shoulders, and he lowered the axe. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes searching her face, checking for cracks, for the fear she had so bravely concealed. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "Yes," she breathed, the word feeling inadequate. "Yes. Thank you, Silas," he gave a short, jerky nod, as if her thanks embarrassed him. He glanced at her hand and saw that she was gripping the handle of the feed bucket so tightly her knuckles were white. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently prying hers loose. "He's gone," he said softly. "You're safe." That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was not the silence of strangers coexisting, nor the comfortable quiet of shared routine. It was a silence filled with the weight of what had happened, of the word he had used and the stand he had taken. It was a silence that buzzed with a new and potent intimacy. Elara was tending to the fire when she noticed a dark stain spreading on the sleeve of his shirt, near his wrist. "You're hurt," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. He looked down, surprised, as if he hadn't even noticed. A long, shallow cut, likely from a stray nail in the barn, had been reopened during the confrontation. "It's nothing, let me see," she insisted. She took his hand, her touch gentle but firm, and led him to the table. She lit another lantern, the soft yellow light pushing back the shadows. She fetched the small tin of antiseptic salve and a roll of clean linen she had prepared for just such an occasion. As she cleaned the wound, her touch was deft and sure. He sat perfectly still, watching her, his gaze intense. His hand, which could split a log with a single blow, was pliant and trusting in hers. This simple act of tending to his wound felt more intimate than any conversation they had ever had. It was an exchange of trust, of care, a quiet acknowledgement of their bond. "He'll be back," she said softly, her eyes on her work. "He won't let this go, I know," Silas said. "Croft's family has wanted this land for 2 generations. His grandfather tried to cheat my father out of it with false claims and forged papers. That's why my father never trusted the town, or its laws. It's why I don't." It was the most he had ever told her about his past, an explanation for his isolation that resonated deep within her. His solitude wasn't born of misanthropy, it was a shield, forged in a fire of betrayal. "He said he'd bring the sheriff," she worried. "The sheriff is Croft's cousin," Silas stated, a fact that landed with grim finality. "The law in Providence Gulch is whatever Croft says it is." Elara finished bandaging his wrist, her fingers lingering for a moment on his skin. She looked up and met his gaze. The firelight danced in his gray eyes, and in their depths, she no longer saw a cold, distant stranger. She saw a man who had been wronged, a man who had chosen a lonely fortress over a corrupt world. And he, in turn, was looking at her not as a burden or a housekeeper, but as an equal. An ally. "Then we'll face him together," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of Silas's mouth. It was the first time she had ever seen him almost smile, and it transformed his harsh features, revealing a warmth she had never imagined was there. In that moment, the contract between them was irrevocably broken, replaced by something far stronger, something forged not of necessity, but of mutual respect, shared hardship, and a fierce, unspoken loyalty. They were no longer just partners in survival. They were partners. Deep winter descended, a season of profound stillness. The world outside the cabin was a study in white and gray, the trees heavy with snow, the sky a perpetual sheet of pale slate. Croft did not return. The threat of his promised legal action remained a distant shadow, held at bay by the impassable drifts and the mountain's icy grip. But the confrontation had changed everything within the cabin's warm, firelit walls. The space between Elara's cot and Silas's bed no longer felt like a chasm. The silence that fell between them now was comfortable, companionable, woven through with a thread of shared understanding. They had faced a common enemy, and in doing so, had found an unshakable alliance. Elara found herself watching him with a new perspective. She saw not just the capable survivor, but the man beneath. She saw the way his eyes would soften when he looked at the sunrise, the quiet satisfaction on his face after a day of hard, productive work. She saw the lonely boy who had lost his sister, the weary man who had been betrayed by the world below. She began to see the fortress of his solitude not as a rejection of the world, but as a fierce protection of the small part of it he could control and trust. He, too, saw her differently. He saw the steel beneath her quiet demeanor, the resilience that had carried her up his mountain and allowed her to flourish in its harsh environment. He had offered her shelter, and she, in turn, had offered him something he hadn't realized he was missing: companionship. She had brought a quiet light into the corners of his solitary life, her presence a steady, gentle warmth against the cold. The days settled into a new rhythm, one that was less about duty and more about partnership. They moved together with an unspoken synchronicity. When the snow on the roof grew too heavy, he would climb up to shovel it off while she stood below, directing him to the weakest spots she had identified from inside. When a batch of bread rose perfectly, she would cut him the first warm, steaming slice, and the quiet nod of approval he gave her was more satisfying than a flowery compliment. One evening, he was sitting by the fire, a block of pine and a whittling knife in his hands. He worked silently, the blade moving with practiced ease, thin curls of wood falling to the hearthstone. Elara sat nearby, mending a tear in one of her blankets, the rhythmic pull of her needle a quiet counterpoint to the soft scrape of his knife. She had been thinking about her old life, about Thomas. The memory was no longer a sharp, open wound, but a dull, distant ache. Thomas had been a man of grand words and empty promises. He had spoken often of love and devotion, but his actions had always fallen short. Silas was the opposite. He was a man of few words, but his actions were a testament to a loyalty and protectiveness she had never known. He had never spoken of care, but he showed it in the extra log on the fire, the secure nail on a loose floorboard, the way he stood between her and the world. He had called her his wife. The word still echoed in her mind. It had been a tactical move, a declaration to ward off a predator. But she knew, in the quiet certainty of her own heart, that it had also been the truth. Not a truth sanctioned by a preacher or a piece of paper, but a deeper truth forged in the crucible of their shared winter. He finished his work and held out his hand. In his palm lay a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. The detail was remarkable, each feather etched with precision. It was a thing of simple, profound beauty. "For you," he said, his voice a low rumble. Elara put down her sewing, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't name. She reached out and took the bird from him. It was smooth and warm from his hand. Her fingers brushed against his, and this time, neither of them pulled away. The contact was deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. "It's beautiful, Silas," she whispered. "Thank you," he simply nodded, his gaze holding hers. In his eyes, she saw the end of a long, lonely winter and the promise of a new spring. No grand declarations were made. None were needed. Their story was not written in words, but in the shared labor of survival, in the silent language of mutual respect, in the simple, profound act of two lonely souls finding refuge in one another. She had come to his mountain seeking a reprieve from death, a bargain for survival. She had been a desperate widow, stripped of everything she thought she was. But here, in this wild, isolated place, she had found something she had never expected, herself. She was not a victim of circumstance. She was a woman who had faced the edge of the abyss and had chosen to climb. She had forged her own home, her own family, her own future, not with a man of the town, but with a man of the mountain. Outside, the wind picked up, but it no longer sounded like a threat. It was just the wind. Inside the cabin, the fire burned bright and steady. Elara placed the small wooden bird on the mantelpiece, a new and hopeful icon in their shared sanctuary. The winter was still deep, but it was no longer lonely. There was warmth enough to last until the thaw.